Well, joining me to talk about a number of issues of the day is the fantastic conservative commentator, radio host, Erick Erickson. Erick, thank you for joining me. How are you, sir?
I'm great. Thanks for having me.
It's good to talk to you again. And one of the stories that I think here in terms of what we're covering at the Christian Broadcasting Network, obviously we're focusing a lot on the faith-based stories. And one of the biggest stories has been with the Southern Baptist Convention that is coming up next week, June 11th and 12th. And I'm sure there are a number of major issues that they're going to be discussing at this conference. But what in particular are you paying attention to as far as this conference is concerned?
I think the law amendment is probably the most important thing. They've considered it before overwhelming support. There's been a pressure campaign, I think, to get some churches to not support it, but I would not be surprised to see them implement it. And frankly, I think it's a good thing if they do, to provide needed clarity on cooperation within the denomination of those who share a common agreement on Scripture over the role of the pastor.
And in particular, the role of the pastor, the conversation has been about whether to allow female pastors to lead churches, correct?
Yes. As I've said repeatedly, it's not a coincidence that the denominations that have ultimately decided the role of pastor can be made more contemporary by adding female pastors are all the denominations that have ultimately walked away from the faith over the issue of gay ordination and gay marriage. If you can begin taking a portion of Scripture and saying, well, it doesn't apply to our times, there's no lever to stop that shift over time. So you either hold the line on what is pretty clear in Scripture, or you don't hold the line.
For those who haven't been paying attention, is how big a problem has this become for Southern Baptists, and how big an issue will this be at the convention?
So it's not a huge problem. They certainly made waves by deciding to no longer cooperate with Saddleback, that was Rick Warren's church, over the role of female pastors. And there have certainly been churches. They're dealing with one now, First Baptist Church of Alexandria, Virginia, where they have placed women in pastoral roles and said they do not read Scripture to prohibit women from being in a pastoral role. The problem is the Baptist Faith and Message that they all agree to says that the role of a senior pastor in particular is a leadership role for men. And when you have churches within a denomination saying, well, we read that differently, what are the roles of cooperation? At some point, you're either in or you're out. What are the boundaries? And the Baptist Faith and Message should be that boundary, but some churches have disagreed. So I think this provides clarity not on what it means to be a Baptist church, but what it means to be in cooperation with the Southern Baptist Convention.
I want to switch topics and kind of get into more of the political area now. And one of the issues that has been making headlines over the last couple of weeks are these two flags that appeared outside the homes of Supreme Court Justice Samuel Alito. One, the upside down American flag. The other, of course, what's called the Appeal to Heaven flag. We know the Appeal to Heaven flag has been around for a very long time, but has gained in popularity really over the last few years. And we saw it being waved in the crowds during the January 6th attack on the Capitol. There are a number of people who are concerned about this flag being flown outside of Justice Alito's home. Does he have a sympathy towards January 6 defendants by flying this flag? And there are some calling for him to be recused from any January 6 cases that come before him. What say you on this?
Yeah, I think this is a manufactured controversy. The city of San Francisco has flown the Appeal to Heaven flag until last week, when suddenly it became controversial. It's amazing how the media and the left get to say, well, this flag and this action is controversial. And it's only because of the cases before the Supreme Court. This is about discrediting Sam Alito in the court. It's not actually about the flags. The Washington Post considered the upside down flag story at the time it happened and decided it was about a neighborly dispute. It's only become something sinister because the left is trying to discredit the Supreme Court. And what I find so funny here is that the media organizations that have bought into this story from the left are also the ones giving Judge Merchan in Donald Trump's trial a complete pass for giving money to a fund that was specifically earmarked for, quote, stop Donald Trump and his right-wing legacy. If the flag is an appearance of impropriety, that is an impropriety. And the fact that the media is excusing that donation and demanding Alito recuse himself now shows how political this whole story is.
Are you concerned about the level of political engagement I mean, I imagine you are, but I guess the question is, how concerned are you about the level of political engagement that we're now seeing in the judicial system? It used to be, I mean, the Supreme Court has always been somewhat political. You've always had so-called conservative, so-called liberal justices, but it seems as though in over the last 10, 15 years that it's really been ramped up, and now we're seeing it moved along to the local and the state and all that kind of stuff. How big a problem is this in terms of Americans having confidence in their legal and their judicial system?
You know, what I find very notable is that Democrats are insisting that partisan elected judges, like the judges in New York, are somehow sacrosanct. We can't question them. But the politically appointed lifetime tenured judges of the federal courts are somehow bad. And the common denominator is the left doesn't control those judges. Therefore, they're seeking to undermine them. And at the state level, there's always been this issue. When judges are allowed to run for office under a partisan label and give partisan donations, I think you can question that. What I find very notable is that a dozen of Trump's appointed judges heard cases related to the 2020 election and threw them all out. If they were the partisan operatives that the left claimed, they would have probably helped Donald Trump. Instead, they didn't. The Supreme Court itself, with Donald Trump's appointees, refused to hear those cases. So there's really no evidence base that these federal judges are biased. But at the state level, when you're a Democrat judge giving money to Joe Biden and to stop Donald Trump, I think you can say there's bias there. That the left wants us to focus on the federal judges where there's really no evidence and ignore the state judges tells you that they're trying to seed this doubt with the American public just because they don't control the institution anymore.
I'll play devil's advocate for a second and argue the other side just to, because I'm curious what to hear your thought on this would be. Conservatives don't seem to have an issue with conservative Supreme Court justices, like you said, being appointed, but do have an issue with these state judges, these state officials who clearly they get elected. Like in Manhattan, it's a Democratic stronghold. It's understandable that Democrats would elect Democrats to run these courts. Is there a double standard on the Republican side, on the conservative side in that regard?
I don't think so, because there's a role of judicial ethics and judicial ethics guidelines. Had Sam Alito been giving partisan donations to Donald Trump, then I think he would be disqualified, in addition to violating judicial ethics. When you take Judge Merchan, he actually gave money to Joe Biden and to stop Donald Trump, a fund designated to stop Donald Trump. That's a sign of clear bias, and that contradicts judicial ethics. Now, he had an ethics commission tell him, don't worry about it, but I think that's something you should worry about. Just based on standard judicial ethics shared by every judiciary in the country, judges aren't supposed to give partisan donations, and yet he did.
What do you make of Attorney General Merrick Garland's testimony on Capitol Hill, where he was denying any involvement with the DOJ having anything to do with the Trump hush money trial, and answering back pretty forcefully against Republicans who believe that he is at the head of a weaponization of the Justice Department against Donald Trump and against Republican critics?
You know, I think the Democrats said the same thing about Bill Barr as the Attorney General. Republicans say this about Merrick Garland. I'm a little more dismissive of this than a lot of my Republican friends. Yes, did they have someone from the DOJ who took a leave of absence? Yes, every Democrat wanted to get Donald Trump. They allowed him to do it in the same way Republicans have allowed leaves of absence in the past. So I look, I'm not a fan of Merrick Garland. I do think that Merrick Garland makes political decisions, partisan decisions, in a way he denies. But it's also a partisan office. So I've never been a big proponent of Democrats attacking Republicans in that regard, or Republicans attacking Democrats. At the end of the day, Merrick Garland is a political appointee accountable to the president. The idea that the Attorney General is somehow standoffish and unique, I don't actually think that flies under American legal theory, even though both sides say it does.
What do you think the guilty verdict means for this summer in the presidential election? Is it moving the needle? Do you think it will move the needle even as we get further along from the verdict and it becomes less in our minds? Is it going to have a big impact on who votes for Donald Trump and who votes for Joe Biden ultimately?
I don't think so. In fact, we're starting to see polling come out, and you can quibble with the polling, but when every poll is headed in the same direction, there's a trend they're picking up, and that trend is that that this has had no difference. And I do think the longer Republicans vocally point out the judge was a donor to Joe Biden and Alvin Bragg campaigned on prosecuting Donald Trump, it discredits that prosecution more. It gives the Republicans a talking point that I think is a valid talking point, by the way. And most voters, I think, they already thought Donald Trump was crooked. They think Joe Biden is as well. Donald Trump just got found out. Joe Biden didn't. They don't really care. They voters don't like either of these guys, but they like Donald Trump's policies more.
What are you hearing about the VP pick for Trump right now?
You know, I mean, what everybody else has heard, that Doug Burgum, J.D. Vance, Tim Scott, Marco Rubio, a few others are on the list. I think Tim Scott makes the most sense. I'm a little biased towards him. I like Rubio, too, but there's a 12th Amendment problem for him. The president and vice president can't both be from the same state under the Constitution without a penalty. Tim Scott, you've got Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. No one likes either of them. Americans actually like Tim Scott. So you provide Donald Trump, who people don't like, with someone people do like versus two people Americans don't like. The math makes sense to work in his advantage, that Tim Scott can persuade more people to go to Donald Trump than an unknown like a J.D. Vance, who you and I may know because of politics. Most Americans don't. Or Doug Burgum, nobody knows who he is.
You're based out of Georgia, and obviously one of the cases that Trump could have seen come to trial this summer was the election case in Georgia. What are the chances that case begins, finishes, has any kind of movement whatsoever before people head to the polls in November?
Zero. They're not even going to consider the disqualification of Fani Willis at the Court of Appeals until several months from now, and the decision on that probably won't be rendered until 2025. And the Court of Appeals in Georgia has enjoined the case. No action can happen on the case until they've rendered a verdict. So there's no way this case gets off the ground before the election.
Last thing for you here. What's your take on President Biden's executive actions, executive orders on immigration that came out this week?
I think it's all theater. It's not making a difference at the border. There are so many loopholes to it on a fear exemption for migrants that it's really unenforceable. And also, he waited until now to give left-wing groups an opportunity to enjoin it, so that it can't even be enforced until before the election. It was all theater for politics and polling. But the fact that he's doing it and it's not going to work, I think, undermines his claims and probably continues to hurt him with the voters because he looks impotent.
Eric, if people want to find out more about what you have to say, both whether it's in writing or your radio shows or anything else, how do they do that?
The easiest way to do it is to text my name, Erick, E-R-I-C-K, to 33777, and they'll get back links to everything.
Eric, it's always a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Thanks so much.